Imagine the sky cracking open like broken glass, brilliant light pouring through the darkness, and Jesus Christ stepping down from heaven. But this isn't happening when the Bible says it should. The 7 years of terrible suffering that were supposed to come first never happened. The Antichrist was just getting started when everything changed. What if Jesus returned too early and changed everything we thought we knew about the end of the world? Welcome to Divine Mysteries, where we explore forbidden questions and hidden truths of history, religion, and the unknown. If you love journeys that challenge what you thought you knew, make sure to join us, because today's story may change the way you see everything. The ancient books spoke of dark days coming. Prophets warned of suffering like the world had never seen. But on one ordinary Tuesday morning, those prophecies would take a turn that no one saw coming. Chapter 1: The Prophecy Unveiled. For thousands of years, believers have studied the same dark prophecies. Daniel spoke of 70 weeks, with the final week bringing unimaginable horror. John wrote about 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and 7 bowls of God's anger poured out on earth. These weren't pretty bedtime stories. They were warnings about the worst 7 years in human history. The timeline seemed crystal clear to most Bible students. First, Jesus would take his followers to heaven in something called the rapture. Then the Antichrist would rule the world for 7 horrible years, called the Great Tribulation. Finally, Jesus would return with his army to defeat evil and set up his kingdom on earth. Every prophecy teacher knew this order by heart. Every Christian movie showed it the same way. The tribulation had to come first. It was written in stone, or so they thought. But what if they were wrong about the timing? What if God had different plans? Ancient Jewish rabbis called this time period the time of Jacob's trouble. They knew their people would suffer more than ever before. Early church leaders warned that Christians should be ready for the worst persecution in history. Everyone agreed that pain would come before peace. But deep in the mysterious words of Paul's letters, there was a clue that no one fully understood. He wrote about something called the restrainer, a force holding back evil until the right time. What if that restrainer decided to act sooner than expected? What if mercy interrupted the timeline of judgment? Chapter 2: The Night Heaven Opened. Jerusalem hummed with tension on that Tuesday morning. News reports buzzed about a charismatic leader in Europe who was solving impossible problems. Some whispered he might be the Antichrist the Bible warned about. His peace treaty with Israel was supposed to start the countdown to the end times. But at exactly 3:47 p.m. Jerusalem time, everything stopped. The sky didn't just brighten, it tore open like fabric ripping apart. Light poured through that wasn't like any light anyone had ever seen. It didn't hurt your eyes, but it made everything else look grey and lifeless. Then he stepped through, Jesus Christ, exactly as John had described in Revelation. His face shone like the sun, his eyes blazed like fire, and his voice thundered across every continent at once. But this wasn't supposed to happen yet. The tribulation hadn't started. The Antichrist barely had time to introduce himself to the world. Every screen on Earth showed the same impossible sight. Traffic stopped on every highway. Airplanes somehow landed safely as pilots stared in amazement. The internet crashed from billions of people trying to stream the same miraculous moment. World leaders sat frozen in their meetings, their plans suddenly meaningless. The man in Europe, who might have been the Antichrist, fell to his knees and wept. His carefully laid plans crumbled in an instant. The timeline everyone expected had just been shattered by the very person it was supposed to describe. Jesus had returned, but he was 7 years too early. Chapter 3: the moment everything changed. In that single moment, thousands of years of prophetic understanding turned upside down. The book of Revelation sat open in heaven, but its seals remained unbroken. The horsemen of the apocalypse stayed in their stables. The bowls of God's wrath sat full and unused on heaven's altar. Jesus looked across the earth he had come to save and made a choice that surprised even the angels. Instead of allowing the prophesied 7 years of suffering, he decided that humanity had endured enough. Wars, plagues, disasters, and evil had already caused too much pain. The time for judgment could wait. The time for mercy had come. Satan himself stood shocked in the spiritual realm. His carefully crafted plans for humanity's final deception were only half finished. He had spent centuries preparing for his moment of ultimate rebellion, but that moment was being cut short. The dragon's time was up before his greatest hour could even begin. Across the earth, things that were supposed to happen simply didn't. The 144,000 Jewish witnesses who were meant to preach during the tribulation never received their calling. The 2 prophets who were supposed to appear in Jerusalem remained wherever God had hidden them. The mark of the beast, nearly ready to launch, became useless technology overnight. But the biggest change was in the spiritual atmosphere itself. Suddenly, evil didn't feel as strong. Temptation didn't pull as hard. It was as if a heavy blanket of darkness had been lifted from the world. People everywhere reported feeling lighter, cleaner, and more hopeful than they had in years. The prince of this world had been dethroned ahead of schedule. Chapter 4. The Antichrist's Unfinished Kingdom. The man who might have ruled the world for 7 years barely got 3.5 years to build his empire. His global peace treaty with Israel was signed, but never had time to be broken. The temple he planned to defile was still under construction. The mark he wanted to force on every human was still in beta testing. Everything the Antichrist had worked toward became instantly worthless. His quantum computer systems designed to track every person on Earth suddenly served a new master. His global communication network that was meant to spread lies now carried the truth of Christ's presence to every corner of the world. The economic system he had nearly perfected for total control crumbled overnight. His digital currency that was supposed to replace all money became worthless code. The artificial intelligence he had programmed to enforce his will was reprogrammed by divine intervention to serve righteousness instead of rebellion. World leaders who had been ready to bow to this charismatic dictator found themselves bowing to someone far greater. The United Nations building that was supposed to become his headquarters became a place where nations came to learn how to serve the true King of Kings. Most shocking of all, the Antichrist himself wasn't destroyed in some epic battle. He simply knelt before Jesus like everyone else, his power evaporating like morning mist. All his supernatural abilities given by Satan vanished instantly. The man who thought he was destined to be worshipped as God found himself worshipping the real God instead. His unfinished kingdom became a footnote in history rather than its darkest chapter. Chapter 5. Israel's incomplete suffering. The Jewish people had been preparing for their darkest hour, but it never came. Ancient prophecies spoke of 2/3 of Israel being killed during the tribulation. Rabbis taught about the time when Jews would flee to the wilderness for protection. None of it happened. Instead of running for their lives, the Jewish people found themselves face to face with their Messiah. The one their ancestors had rejected was standing right there in Jerusalem, proving who he really was. There was no time for gradual revelation or slow acceptance. The evidence was undeniable, and immediate. The 144,000 young Jewish men who were supposed to become evangelists during the tribulation never got their supernatural calling. They remained ordinary people, living ordinary lives when the extraordinary happened. The two witnesses who were meant to prophesy in Jerusalem for 3.5 years never appeared because their time of service was no longer needed. Orthodox Jews who had spent their lives studying prophecy found themselves in theological shock. Everything they thought they knew about their Messiah's coming was right and wrong at the same time. Yes, he was coming to Jerusalem. Yes, he would rule from David's throne. But no, they wouldn't have to suffer through Jacob's trouble first. The most amazing part was how quickly the recognition came. Without the pressure of persecution and the confusion of tribulation events, the Jewish people could see clearly who Jesus really was. The veil that had covered their understanding for centuries was lifted not through suffering, but through mercy. Their incomplete suffering led to complete revelation. Chapter 6: The Church That Never Left. Christians around the world had been taught to expect the rapture before the tribulation began. They had prepared their hearts to be taken to heaven while the world suffered below. But when Jesus appeared in the sky, something unexpected happened. They were still there. Pastors who had preached about the pre-tribulation rapture found themselves trying to explain why they were still standing in their pulpits. Church members who had expected to be gone looked around at each other in confusion. Had they been left behind? Were they not truly saved? The answer came quickly through Jesus himself. The church wasn't left behind. The church was needed right where it was. Instead of watching the millennium from heaven, believers would help establish it on earth. Instead of being removed from the world, they would help transform it. This created a completely new situation that no theology book had ever covered. Living, breathing Christians with physical bodies were present when Christ began his 1,000-year reign. They didn't have to die first or get raptured first. They transitioned directly from the church age into the millennial kingdom. Denominational differences that had divided Christians for centuries suddenly seemed silly. Pre-tribulation, mid-tribulation, and post-tribulation rapture theories all became meaningless when the tribulation never happened. Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox believers, and every other group found themselves serving the same visible king in the same physical kingdom. The church that never left became the church that got to see prophecy fulfilled in ways they never imagined possible. Chapter 7: The Unopened Seals of Revelation. In heaven's throne room, a scroll remained sealed. John had seen this scroll in his vision on the island of Patmos. It contained the judgments that would devastate the earth during the tribulation. But now those seals would never be broken. The first seal would have released the Antichrist to conquer the world. It stayed closed. The second seal would have brought war to every nation. It remained locked. The third seal would have caused worldwide famine. It was never opened. The fourth seal would have brought death to 1/4 of humanity. It stayed shut forever. The 7 trumpets that would have announced even worse judgments never sounded. The 7 bowls of God's wrath never spilled their contents on the earth. The sun didn't scorch people with fire. The seas didn't turn to blood. The rivers didn't become bitter poison. None of the ecological disasters happened. This created a theological puzzle that scholars would debate for the entire millennial kingdom. What happens to divine justice when divine mercy steps in first? Does God's righteousness require that every judgment be carried out? Or can mercy triumph over judgment even when punishment was deserved? The unopened seals represented something profound about God's character. He had every right to pour out his wrath on a rebellious world. Humanity had certainly earned every bit of judgment described in Revelation. But instead of giving people what they deserved, God chose to give them what they needed: a Savior who came early. The earth that should have been scorched and poisoned remained green and beautiful, ready to become the paradise it was always meant to be. Chapter 8. Technology frozen in time. The infrastructure for the beast's global control system was almost complete when Jesus returned. Satellites designed for total surveillance hung in orbit like abandoned toys. Quantum computers programmed to track every human transaction sat silent in data centers around the world. Artificial intelligence systems that were being trained to recognize faces, monitor behavior, and control access to buying and selling suddenly found themselves serving a very different purpose. Instead of oppressing humanity, they now helped organize the most efficient and fair distribution of resources the world had ever seen. The internet, which was supposed to become a tool for spreading the Antichrist's lies, became the primary way for Jesus to communicate with the entire world at once. Social media platforms that had been designed to divide and deceive people were cleansed overnight of all evil content. Suddenly, the web became a place of truth, encouragement, and genuine connection. Cryptocurrency and digital payment systems that were almost ready to become the mark of the beast became tools for eliminating poverty instead. With Christ himself overseeing every transaction, corruption became impossible. No one could steal, cheat, or hoard resources while others went without. The most remarkable change was in how technology began to serve creation rather than destroying it. Weapons systems designed for war were reprogrammed for construction and healing. Nuclear missiles became space exploration vehicles. Military drones became tools for planting forests and cleaning oceans. Technology that was frozen at the moment of the Antichrist's defeat became the foundation for the most advanced and loving civilization in human history. Chapter 9. Nations that never fell. Revelation had prophesied that all nations would eventually bow to the beast and worship his image. But when Jesus returned early, many countries had still been resisting the Antichrist's influence. These nations found themselves in a unique position in history. Democratic governments that had refused to surrender their sovereignty to the rising world dictator suddenly discovered they could keep their basic structures while serving a righteous king. The United States Congress, the British Parliament, and other democratic institutions didn't disappear overnight. Instead, they learned to make decisions that aligned with Christ's perfect will. Countries that had maintained strong Christian foundations found the transition easier than those that had turned away from faith. Nations like South Korea, parts of Africa, and certain regions of South America discovered that their governments could function quite well under divine oversight. The most interesting cases were countries that had been actively preparing to resist the Antichrist. Some governments had created contingency plans for maintaining independence during the Tribulation period. These plans became the foundation for how earthly kingdoms could serve the heavenly kingdom. Military forces that had been preparing to fight against the beast's armies found themselves learning to fight against poverty, disease, and natural disasters instead. NATO, which was supposed to be dissolved by the Antichrist, became an organization for international cooperation in building paradise on earth. The nations that never fell became the nations that learned how earthly power could serve heavenly purposes in ways that had never been possible before. Chapter 10. The Satan Problem. Satan had been planning his final rebellion for thousands of years. He had carefully orchestrated the rise of the Antichrist, the preparation of global control systems, and the deception of the nations. But when Jesus returned early, all of Satan's plans were cut short in the middle of their execution. The devil had been counting on 7 full years to complete his masterpiece of deception. He had centuries of experience manipulating human governments, religions, and cultures. His plan was nearly perfect, and it was almost time for the grand finale. Then suddenly, it was over. Instead of being cast into the lake of fire after 1,000 years of being bound, Satan found himself bound immediately with his work unfinished. The chain that held him was forged not after his greatest victory, but in the middle of his greatest defeat. This created a unique spiritual situation. For the first time in human history, Satan's influence was completely removed from the world, while billions of people were still alive and making choices. Free will continued to exist, but the great tempter was locked away before he could complete his final temptation. The spiritual atmosphere of Earth changed dramatically. Mental illness rates dropped to almost zero as demonic oppression vanished. Addiction became much easier to overcome without spiritual forces feeding destructive desires. Violence decreased rapidly as the spirit that had been influencing human anger was removed. Children born during the millennial kingdom would grow up never knowing what it felt like to live under Satan's influence. They would experience temptation only from their own human nature, not from supernatural evil forces. This would create a generation unlike any in human history. The Satan problem became the Satan solution, as his early imprisonment created conditions for human flourishing that had never existed before. Chapter 11: The Missing Martyrs. Throughout history, the greatest heroes of faith had been those who died for their beliefs. The book of Revelation painted vivid pictures of countless martyrs who would give their lives during the tribulation rather than worship the beast. But these prophesied martyrs never got their chance to prove their faith through death. Underground churches in hostile nations had been preparing for the ultimate test. Christian leaders had trained believers how to resist torture, how to hide from persecution, and how to stay faithful even unto death. Prison cells were being prepared for those who would refuse the mark of the beast. But the mark never came, and the cells stayed empty. This created a strange theological puzzle. In God's kingdom, those who suffered most for their faith received the greatest rewards. The crown of martyrdom was considered the highest honor a believer could achieve. But what happened to those who were ready to die for Jesus but never got the opportunity? Young Christians who had prepared themselves mentally and spiritually for persecution found themselves living peaceful lives in Christ's visible kingdom instead. Missionaries who expected to be killed for preaching the gospel discovered they could share their faith openly without fear. The underground railroad of secret churches became unnecessary overnight. Some believers struggled with guilt, wondering if they were somehow less faithful because they hadn't been tested by extreme suffering. Others questioned whether their easy path to the millennial kingdom somehow made them second-class citizens compared to historical martyrs who had died for their faith. The missing martyrs became a reminder that God's ways are not always predictable, and sometimes mercy provides a different path to the same destination. Chapter 12: Ancient Prophecies Unfulfilled. Bible scholars face the biggest crisis in the history of biblical interpretation. Thousands of prophecies about the end times simply didn't happen the way they were written. Daniel's 70th week was cut in half. Isaiah's warnings about Israel's suffering went unfulfilled. Jeremiah's descriptions of Jacob's trouble never materialized. Seminary professors, who had spent their entire careers teaching specific interpretations of prophecy, found themselves back at square one. How do you explain to students that literal prophecies might not happen literally? How do you maintain faith in biblical accuracy when biblical predictions didn't come true as expected? Some scholars suggested that the prophecies were conditional, dependent on human choices that God knew might change. Others proposed that the prophecies were fulfilled in spiritual rather than physical ways. Still others argued that mercy had trumped justice in a way that the prophets couldn't have foreseen. The Jewish rabbis faced an even bigger challenge. Their entire understanding of the Messiah's coming was based on prophecies that described him arriving after Israel's greatest suffering. Instead, their Messiah had arrived to prevent that suffering. Their theology had to be rebuilt from the ground up. Ancient books of prophecy that had guided believers for thousands of years suddenly needed footnotes explaining why certain events never occurred. Bible commentaries became historical curiosities rather than practical guides. The science of biblical interpretation had to start over with new rules that nobody understood yet. The unfulfilled prophecies became a testimony to God's sovereignty over his own word and his freedom to show mercy even when justice was promised. Chapter 13. The Gog and Magog Dilemma. Ezekiel's prophecy about the war of Gog and Magog had been one of the most studied predictions in the Bible. Russia, Iran, Turkey, and their allies were supposed to attack Israel in the last days. Military analysts had watched these nations form exactly the alliance Ezekiel described thousands of years earlier. But when Jesus returned early, this massive invasion was still in the planning stages. Russian military bases in Syria were ready. Iranian weapons were positioned on Israel's borders. Turkish forces were aligned with the prophesied coalition. The stage was perfectly set for the war that would never come. This created a major problem for biblical interpretation. Some prophecy teachers had placed this war before the tribulation, others during it, and still others after the millennium. But now there was no tribulation, and the millennium had already begun. When was this war supposed to happen? The military equipment prepared for this invasion sat unused. Missiles that were aimed at Israeli cities were never fired. Armies that had trained for years to attack God's chosen people found themselves learning to serve God's chosen king instead. The greatest military confrontation in biblical prophecy became the greatest military surrender in human history. Intelligence agencies that had spent billions of dollars tracking the development of this alliance suddenly found their work meaningless. War colleges that had studied Ezekiel 38 and 39 as military strategy guides had to rewrite their textbooks. The invasion that was supposed to define the end times never defined anything at all. The Gog and Magog dilemma reminded everyone that God's timing doesn't always match human expectations, even when those expectations are based on biblical prophecy. Chapter 14. The Temple that was never defiled. The third temple in Jerusalem was almost finished when Jesus returned. Jewish craftsmen had spent years recreating the furniture, training the priests, and preparing for worship to resume on the Temple Mount. But this temple was supposed to have a dark destiny. The Antichrist was meant to enter it, declare himself God, and defile it with the abomination of desolation. Instead, Jesus himself entered the temple that was built for his enemy. The Holy of Holies that was supposed to be violated by the man of sin became the earthly throne room of the Son of God. The altar that was prepared for blasphemous sacrifice became the place where perfect worship was restored. Orthodox Jews who had worked on the temple's construction couldn't believe their eyes. The building they had created hoping to bring their Messiah, was immediately occupied by their Messiah. Their dreams of restored temple worship came true in ways they never imagined possible. The temple vessels that had been crafted to match biblical descriptions were suddenly being used by the very God who had given those descriptions to Moses. The priestly garments that had been sewn with meticulous care were worn by priests serving in the presence of the great high priest himself. But this also created theological questions that nobody was prepared to answer. Ezekiel had described a different temple for the millennial kingdom, with different dimensions and different purposes. How did the third temple fit with Ezekiel's temple? Would there be two temples, or would one be transformed into the other? The temple that was never defiled became a symbol of how God can take something prepared for evil and transform it into something beautiful for His glory. Chapter 15: Interfaith Chaos and Divine Resolution. Every major religion in the world had its own version of end times prophecy, and none of them predicted Jesus Christ returning before the tribulation began. This created the greatest interfaith crisis in human history, but also the greatest opportunity for truth to triumph over deception. Muslims had been expecting their Mahdi to appear and lead them to victory over their enemies. Instead, they found themselves face to face with the Jesus they had honored as a prophet, but not recognized as God. Islamic scholars struggled to explain how their prophecies about the end times were being fulfilled by someone they hadn't expected to be the main character. Hindus had been waiting for Kalki, the 10th avatar of Vishnu, to come and restore righteousness to the earth. But Kalki never appeared because Jesus had already taken that role. Buddhist communities expected Maitreya Buddha to bring enlightenment to the world, but perfect enlightenment was already walking the streets of Jerusalem. New Age movements had predicted various forms of ascension, alien contact, or consciousness evolution. None of their channeled messages or cosmic predictions had prepared them for the literal return of the historical Jesus Christ. Their carefully constructed belief systems crumbled in the face of undeniable reality. The most remarkable thing was how quickly many people from other religions recognized the truth when they saw it. Without the confusion of tribulation events and the pressure of persecution, the evidence of who Jesus really was became overwhelming. Conversion wasn't forced, but it was frequent and sincere. Interfaith dialogue took on a completely different meaning when one faith was represented by its founder in person, while the others were represented only by their followers and their books. Chapter 16: Geopolitics in the Age of Christ. The United Nations building in New York became an interesting place after Jesus returned early. Diplomats who had spent their careers negotiating between nations suddenly found themselves reporting to a king whose authority came from heaven rather than human votes. International law had to be completely rewritten. Treaties between nations became less important than each nation's relationship with the King of Kings. The Security Council found itself consulting with Jerusalem on every major decision, not because they were forced to, but because it was obviously the wisest thing to do. Nuclear weapons became the most embarrassing technology on Earth. Countries that had spent trillions of dollars building weapons of mass destruction found themselves dismantling them under the watchful eye of someone who could destroy the world with a word if he chose to. The nuclear club became the nuclear cleanup crew. NATO, the Warsaw Pact, and other military alliances transformed from defensive organizations into construction companies. Armies that had trained to fight each other started working together to build the infrastructure for a kingdom that would last 1,000 years. Military budgets were redirected toward education, healthcare, and environmental restoration. The most challenging aspect was figuring out how human government could function under divine government. Democracy had to learn to operate within theocracy. Free elections continued, but candidates had to campaign on platforms that aligned with biblical principles. Political parties discovered that their differences seemed much smaller when measured against perfect righteousness. Geopolitics in the age of Christ became less about power struggles between nations and more about cooperation in building the kingdom of heaven on earth. Chapter 17. Science and Faith Collide. University science departments around the world faced an unprecedented crisis when Jesus returned early. Theories that had been taught as fact for centuries were suddenly contradicted by observable reality. The scientific method itself had to adapt to a world where supernatural events were happening daily. Evolutionary biology professors found themselves trying to explain their theories to students who could walk to Jerusalem and ask the Creator himself how life began. Geology textbooks that described millions of years of Earth's history had to account for a planet that might be much younger than previously thought. Climate science took on new meaning when the one who controlled weather was physically present on Earth. Environmental researchers discovered that their computer models were unnecessary when they could simply ask Jesus what the climate would be like next year. Medical schools struggled to train doctors in a world where divine healing was available. Why study cancer treatment when cancer could be cured by prayer? Why research genetic disorders when the designer of genetics was available for consultation? Yet somehow, human knowledge and divine power found ways to work together rather than compete. Space exploration agencies had to reconsider their priorities. Was it still important to search for life on other planets when the source of all life was ruling from Earth? Did humans need to become a multi-planetary species when Earth was being transformed into paradise? The most profound change was in the philosophy of science itself. The assumption that natural laws operated without supernatural intervention was no longer sustainable. Science and faith didn't just coexist. They merged into a single pursuit of understanding God's creation under God's direct guidance. Chapter 18. Digital Age Discipleship. Social media platforms underwent the most dramatic transformation in the history of the internet when Jesus returned early. Algorithms that had been designed to promote conflict, spread misinformation, and harvest personal data were reprogrammed overnight to encourage truth, kindness, and genuine human connection. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and other platforms found their content automatically filtered by divine wisdom. Hate speech vanished not because it was censored, but because people stopped wanting to post it. Fake news became impossible to spread when the source of all truth was actively monitoring every communication network. Artificial intelligence systems that had been trained on biased human data suddenly began operating with perfect moral judgment. ChatGPT and similar AI tools became incredibly wise counselors rather than just clever text generators. Machine learning evolved into divine learning as algorithms were guided by perfect intelligence. The smartphone addiction that had plagued billions of people began to fade as digital entertainment became less appealing than real-world community in the kingdom of God.
Virtual reality lost its appeal when actual reality had become more wonderful than any simulated experience.
Cryptocurrency and blockchain technology found new purposes in creating transparent systems for resource distribution and volunteer coordination. The same technologies that had been prepared for the mark of the beast became tools for eliminating poverty and organizing acts of service. Online education exploded as people around the world gained access to teachers who had learned directly from Jesus himself. The internet became the greatest tool for discipleship in history, connecting seekers with mentors and creating global communities of faith that transcended national boundaries. Digital age discipleship meant learning to use technology as a tool for building God's kingdom rather than escaping from it. Chapter 19: The question that haunts eternity. As the millennial kingdom flourished and the earth became more beautiful each day, a haunting question began to emerge in the hearts of thoughtful believers. Had humanity missed something important by avoiding the tribulation? Was there a purpose to suffering that mercy had interrupted? Throughout history, the greatest saints had been forged in the fires of persecution. The strongest faith had emerged from the darkest trials. Character had been built through struggle, and wisdom had come through pain. But what happened to human development when the pain was removed before it could do its work? Some wondered if they were somehow less mature believers because their path to the kingdom had been easier than expected. Others questioned whether avoiding the tribulation had cheated them out of spiritual growth that could only come through extreme testing. Parents struggled with how to raise children who would never know temptation from Satan, persecution for their faith, or the challenge of choosing God in the face of overwhelming opposition. Would these children develop the same depth of character as previous generations who had suffered for their beliefs? The question wasn't whether God had made the right choice in returning early. His decisions were perfect by definition. The question was whether humans could fully appreciate grace without first experiencing the full weight of justice. Could mercy be truly understood without suffering? Yet as people wrestled with these thoughts, they began to realize that there were other ways to grow besides through pain. Service could build character as effectively as suffering. Love could mature souls as deeply as loss. Joy could teach lessons that sorrow never could. The question that haunted eternity became an invitation to discover new ways of becoming like Christ in a world where Christ was visibly present. Chapter 20: The seal that remains unbroken. Deep in the throne room of heaven, surrounded by creatures whose faces shine like lightning and whose voices shake the foundations of eternity, there sits a scroll. This scroll contains judgments that were prepared but never poured out, wrath that was deserved but never delivered, justice that was promised but never executed. The seventh seal remains unbroken. The final trumpet has never sounded. The last bowl of God's anger sits full and unused on the altar of heaven. What happens to divine justice when divine mercy intervenes? What becomes of righteous judgment when righteous love chooses a different path? Some angels who had prepared to pour out these judgments found themselves reassigned to tasks of restoration instead of destruction. Heavenly armies that had polished their swords for the final battle learned to use their weapons for building rather than breaking. But the scroll remains. The seals are still there, waiting. The judgments are still prepared, ready to be unleashed if mercy should ever step aside. The wrath of God has not been cancelled, only postponed. The justice of God has not been abandoned, only transformed. As the millennial kingdom progresses and the earth becomes more beautiful each year, wise believers sometimes look toward heaven and wonder. They wonder about the scrolls that were never opened, the seals that were never broken, the judgments that were never poured out. And in the deepest mysteries of eternity, they sense that this story is not over. that mercy and justice will dance together in ways that finite minds cannot yet comprehend, that the God who surprised everyone by returning early might have more surprises waiting in the scrolls of heaven. The seal that remains unbroken holds secrets that even the angels long to understand. And somewhere in the infinite wisdom of God, those secrets are waiting for their perfect moment to be revealed.